Hi, I'm Ingrid Salim, and this is my project on STEM and special groups titled Finding Global Solutions Using Global Perspectives, STEM Access for All Students, a focus on Hispanics. I live in Davis, California, which is in the northern part of the state near Sacramento, the capital, and it is the home of University of California at Davis. So we are basically a university town, and we have the demographics that would reflect that. The majority of our students are white, and they are typically middle to upper middle class. The next greatest one are Hispanics. However, of that group, many of them are not upper middle class, and so they do tend to be our lowest socioeconomic group, and they tend to be part of our achievement gap, which is why I chose to focus on them. We have a large Asian contingency, largely thanks to the university's proximity. And then we have a smattering of other groups as well, but none as large as that Hispanic group. So I did choose to focus on our Hispanic group because they do make up about 15 to 17% of our population in any given year, and because they do represent the highest at-risk group that we have in our district, and we really haven't done what we said we would do to close the achievement gap that involves them, and that's for lots of different reasons. But that can certainly be addressed with STEM. I think that would be a really huge leap forward to involve our students in projects that engage them exactly where they are. So in my needs assessment, I was starting with literature and with what I gained from doing the research there, and these three ideas really jumped out at me. One was that we really do need to make learning accessible for everyone, and one way to do that is to make it culturally relevant. And I did used to think that that meant specific, say, to a Hispanic culture. And I now understand that it simply has to be relevant and meaningful to the child, and that may be best achieved with some openness where they can choose how they're going to spend their cognitive thinking time. It also is through a global context or perspective. So for STEM in science and engineering, certainly the problems that we're facing as a planet are global, and so they are relevant to everyone on the planet, and students can embrace that. So being aware of whether or not a topic or a way of approaching a topic will be engaging to all of our students, and how we can frame it so that it is a very important piece. Similar, we can't just expect students to jump into these topics or these disciplines in high school if they've not had the right grounding beforehand. So we need to be targeting and very intentionally putting STEM processes and challenges and tasks into place much earlier. And then finally, this is true from the project-based learning movement and the problem-based learning movement, that students respond best, they're most engaged when they have voice and choice in what they're doing. And that just really involves creativity on the parts of instructors to offer various scenarios and things that students can do to work out the concepts that they're learning. So in my needs assessment, I did a few things. One is a survey that I did with all of my students, and then I filtered out the responses of my Hispanic students, and I was not surprised to find that most of my Hispanic students identified with the U.S., particularly at this time of some political upheaval here. They are all citizens of the United States, even though not all of their parents are, and some of their parents are undocumented. So this is interesting to know. And similarly, their ethnicity is a little bit more clear to them, although even there, a number of Hispanic students were not willing to identify themselves as Hispanic. Most were, though. My students who are Hispanic definitely identified a difference between the culture at home and the culture at school, and their ways of understanding that had much more to do with food and language, and the subtle differences that might be translated from one arena to the next were not things that they were focused on. So these data are representing all of my classes. So I am pulling the Hispanic ones to comment on because I know what their responses were, and they were the ones who were most strong about their ethnicity mattering to them, which of course makes sense. I was encouraged to see that almost all of our students believe that their teachers have high expectations of them, and was not surprised to see that they thought they would be more successful if topics were more relevant. And that shouldn't surprise any of us. In interviews with my students, I then pulled out some, I had students do some writing, and from that I pulled out several students to respond to an oral interview. And I did it individually so the group factor would not impact them. And these are the pieces that came out, that students actually aren't so confident about math. They were confident about every other subject area, but not math. And we know that that's a skill in STEM careers that can get in the way, even if it's just in the way of the confidence factor. That's something we need to target and fix, at least certainly in my district. They really didn't have any understanding of career options. They could only cite a couple, and most of the things that they cited were related to their own parents and family. So that's definitely a weak point in our program. They were very optimistic about facing challenges and having teachers having high expectations, even in this oral interview, believing that they can succeed. I saw quite a change actually from, say, 15 years ago when that might not have been true of our Hispanic community. So that was heartening. At the same time, I'm aware more of the challenges that might affect their performance or their ability to achieve. And while they're able to cope and they don't see those challenges as getting in the way, they still are there. They did all say that they would appreciate more assignments that felt relevant and personally meaningful. And in that interview, partly because of the responses earlier in trying to get them to do this with me, and we have a good rapport, but it came out that there's a lot of angst here in California amongst our Hispanic communities around possibilities of the election. And the fear is real, and they don't know exactly who they can trust, either at school or in their community. So there's been a lot of internalizing amongst their community, and the students were not feeling so comfortable. So I spent a whole day discussing that topic in terms of what is race and what is culture, and even where I stood on the political spectrum, so that there was no fear in my students when they came to class about where they were, about what their status was. And I have to say that having had that conversation, the demeanor with all of those students has changed for the better, and they clearly are more willing to engage. And it heightened for me how nothing outside of our classroom should be off limits in terms of understanding how it's affecting our students. And the first part was the very obvious one of really focusing on culturally relevant pedagogy. I'm a project-based person, sometimes anyway. I do that approach makes a lot of sense for helping students make sense of what they're seeing. However, paying attention to the specifics, which is really about paying attention to how students are responding, that if I see students who are lethargic or apathetic, I might need to look at what the challenge is that I'm giving them. So my first one was I've actually already done this part, was to give them a project around weather. That was our NGSS focus, and have them create a weather report on an event or in a specific place. And a number of my Hispanic students chose a place in Mexico, and they were very intrigued with that problem. Now, I wouldn't say this led necessarily to higher performance ratings in terms of their understanding the content, but because they actually were doing the project and finishing it, they did get more out of it than they would have otherwise. So the next step is to really up the content level. The second thing that we're in the middle of doing right now is a human impact engineering challenge around climate change, again because climate change is a focus of 6th grade. And here I'm having them, after learning much about how is the climate changing and why, the science behind it, they're choosing a problem to brainstorm solutions for and try to solve. And what's really amazed me here is that a number of Hispanic students are completely engaged and enthralled with this topic. They're looking things up on their own. They're reading articles that they might not have even touched before, and they're thinking quite deeply. It's been the most rewarding experience that I've had in teaching in a long time. And then finally, I do plan to create a career project that is involving looking at multiple careers all around climate change, since we've talked about this as a science topic, and since there's multiple careers, not just STEM careers, but other ones as well. And I've become more aware of needing to mention kind of what people do in the real world around these topics, so that they have an awareness of at least an awareness, at least a mention of the kinds of things you can do in life today, which will change. To assess how well these action plans are working, I do have my students complete, I use rubrics to evaluate their work, and that's a very good way to see whether or not what they're doing has impacted their learning, or that the fact that they're actually finishing a project and meeting the criteria, which by itself means that they've done something. So that's my first sort of line of assessment, is what's the content and what's the work product that comes out of whatever we're doing, and is it meeting the standards that I've set for that product. Secondly, asking students, literally using Likert surveys, and I've believed in them for a long time because I do need feedback from students about various aspects of it, the learning, the content, the working in a group, the whether or not it was engaging, whether it was meaningful, and these are ways that I would use to assess whether the project had met my goals and whether it needed to be tweaked or just dumped. And finally, oral interviews about those very same topics, but probing more deeply into students about why a particular approach to a topic worked for them, would be my third way to assess whether this action plan was actually working. And thank you for looking at my project. These are my references for the entire thing. I really did enjoy doing this. So thank you.